When the curtain fell on the Moscow Variety Theatre stage in January 1982, one of the Soviet Union's most beloved comedians walked off stage for the final time. Not to applause, but to a KGB summons that would end his career within hours. Arkady Rykin had spent 4 decades making millions laugh, while navigating an invisible minefield where a single misplaced joke could mean exile, where fame offered no protection, and where the boundary between permitted satire and political suicide shifted without warning. How did Soviet performers achieve stardom in a system designed to crush individual expression? And what price did they pay for every moment in the spotlight? The paradox of Soviet show business was absolute from its inception. The state needed entertainers to project joy, vitality, and the superiority of socialist culture both domestically and abroad. Yet it could never fully trust the very people it elevated to celebrity status. Every singer, actor, comedian, and dancer operated under a contradiction that would have been comedic if it were not so dangerous. They were required to seem spontaneous, charismatic, and genuine while following scripts vetted by multiple censorship layers, performing emotions prescribed by cultural commissars, and maintaining absolute loyalty to a political system that viewed all independent thought as potential treason. This was not merely restrictive, it was a daily psychological operation that required performers to internalize their own surveillance. The machinery of control began long before any performer reached a stage. Soviet show business funneled talent through state institutions from childhood, identifying promising singers and dancers as early as age 6 or 7 for placement in specialized schools. These institutions, like the Vaganova Academy in Leningrad or the Moscow State Institute of Theatrical Art, did not simply train technique. They screened for political reliability across generations. Family background checks extended to grandparents, a single relative who had owned property before the revolution, who had fled abroad, or who had been labeled an enemy of the people, could disqualify even the most gifted child. Those who passed this initial filter entered a system where artistic development and ideological conditioning were inseparable, where every folk song carried a lesson about collective triumph, where even ballet positions were subject to interpretation through the lens of socialist realism. If you're watching this because you want to understand not just what happened in Soviet history, but how systems of control actually functioned at the human level, how people navigated impossible choices, and what the mechanics of ideological enforcement looked like in practice, subscribe now because this channel exists to take you inside those mechanisms with documented evidence and concrete examples. By the time a performer reached professional status, they had already survived a selection process more rigorous than most intelligence agencies employ for field operatives. But professional work introduced an entirely new layer of control, repertoire approval. Every song, every comedy sketch, every theatrical production required clearance from Glavlit, the state censorship agency, and often from additional party cultural committees. The process was deliberately opaque. Guidelines existed, but they were intentionally vague, leaving individual censors with enormous discretion and performers with no clear map of what would be approved. A love song might be rejected for being insufficiently optimistic about socialist construction. A comedy routine about housing shortages might be approved one month and banned the next when housing policy became politically sensitive. Performers submitted material weeks or months in advance, waited for decisions that came without explanation, and adjusted or abandoned work based on rejections they could not appeal. The singer Muslim Magomayev discovered this system's capriciousness at the height of his fame in the mid-1960s. Magomayev possessed a voice that made him the Soviet Union's answer to Western crooners, and his recordings sold millions of copies through the state recording monopoly Melodea. He wanted to record a particular romantic ballad that made no political reference whatsoever, a simple song about lost love set to a sweeping orchestral arrangement. The censors rejected it 3 times without explanation. Only years later did Magomayev learn through informal channels that the song's lyricist had a brother who had emigrated to Israel, making anything associated with that writer politically radioactive regardless of content. The system operated on guilt by association, extending outward in concentric circles that performers could not see, and often could not discover until after their careers had been damaged. This opacity served a specific purpose. It kept performers in a state of permanent uncertainty, never quite sure where the boundaries lay, which made self-censorship far more effective than external censorship alone could ever be. Performers internalized caution, rejecting material before submitting it, avoiding entire subjects, and developing an intuitive sense of the permissible that was always more restrictive than what the censors might actually forbid. The system thus achieved control not through explicit rules but through ambient anxiety, a psychological state that made performers complicit in their own restriction. They policed themselves more harshly than any censor would, and they did so because the consequences of miscalculation were severe and examples were made with deliberate publicity. The comedian Mikhail Zhevanetsky learned this in 1969 when he performed a sketch in Odessa about Soviet service industry inefficiency. The sketch was observational humor, gently mocking slow restaurant service and indifferent shop clerks, subjects that seemed safely within the bounds of permitted satire, since the party itself frequently criticized service quality. The audience responded with sustained laughter and applause. 2 days later, Zhevanetsky was summoned to a party office and informed that his sketch constituted anti-Soviet agitation because it presented socialist labor in a negative light. He was banned from performing in Odessa for 6 months. The message was clear. Even when criticizing something the party also criticized, a comedian could cross an invisible line by making people laugh too hard, by allowing criticism to feel too satisfying, by creating a moment of collective catharsis that briefly united an audience in shared frustration with the system. Comedy was permitted only insofar as it released pressure without directing it. Yet despite these controls, or perhaps because of them, Soviet performers developed techniques of indirection that created space for genuine artistry and even subtle subversion. The theater director Yuri Lyubimov pioneered one such technique at Moscow's Taganka Theater in the 1970s, staging productions of classic Russian literature that used historical settings to comment obliquely on contemporary Soviet life. His 1971 production of Bulgakov's Master and Margarita technically adapted a novel that had been published in the Soviet Union and thus was officially acceptable material, but Lyubimov's staging emphasized themes of artistic persecution, bureaucratic absurdity, and the collision between individual conscience and totalitarian power. Audiences understood the contemporary parallels immediately. Censors understood them too, but shutting down a production of approved Soviet literature would require admitting that the parallels existed, which would validate the very criticism the production implied. Lyubimov operated in this narrow space for over a decade, always technically within bounds while continuously testing them. Musicians found different methods. The jazz pianist Leonid Chizik performed throughout the 1960s and 1970s in a style that borrowed from Western jazz traditions the Soviet authorities viewed with deep suspicion as decadent American influence. Chizik could not simply play bebop. That would invite immediate professional consequences. Instead, he incorporated jazz harmonies and improvisational elements into arrangements of Russian folk songs and Soviet patriotic music, creating a hybrid that satisfied censors while allowing him to develop his actual artistic interests. He described this process years later as learning to speak 2 languages simultaneously, maintaining a surface conversation that censors could approve while conducting a deeper musical dialogue with informed listeners who understood the techniques he was actually employing. Every performance was a negotiation, every arrangement a compromise, but within those constraints, genuine artistry occurred. The constraints themselves sometimes generated creativity by forcing performers to solve problems that would not exist in less restrictive systems. When the songwriter Alexander Gradsky wanted to incorporate rock music elements into Soviet popular music in the early 1970s, direct imitation of Western rock was impossible. The authorities considered rock music inherently ideologically hostile. Gradsky, instead, studied Russian Orthodox Church music and found in its modal structures and vocal techniques elements that could be combined with rock instrumentation to create something that sounded powerful and contemporary, while maintaining roots in Russian tradition that made it defensible. His 1973 album, Russian Songs, fused hard rock arrangements with subjects from Russian history and folklore, creating a sound that satisfied his artistic goals while providing enough nationalist content to pass censorship. The album sold over 1 million copies, and Gradsky became one of Soviet rock's founding figures, not despite the restrictions but through his particular solution to them. Yet for every performer who successfully navigated the system, dozens saw their careers destroyed for miscalculations or for simply being caught in political shifts they could not anticipate. The singer and actress Lyudmila Gurchenko experienced this in 1956 when she starred in the film Carnival Night, which became a massive popular success. Gurchenko's performance, full of energy and charm, made her instantly famous across the Soviet Union. She appeared poised for major stardom, but within 2 years she could barely find work. The problem was not anything she had done, it was that her fame had come during the brief cultural thaw under Khrushchev, and when the political climate shifted more conservative, she became associated with a moment the authorities now wanted to move past. She spent the next decade in professional wilderness, taking minor roles and provincial theater work, her career derailed not by failure, but by success at the wrong moment. The Soviet system did not just punish transgression, it punished association with periods that later fell out of favor, which meant performers could do everything right and still find themselves unemployable when political winds changed. The state's relationship with its biggest stars revealed the system's fundamental contradiction most clearly. The ballet dancers Maya Plisetskaya and Rudolf Nureyev both achieved international recognition that brought prestige to the Soviet Union, which the authorities valued enormously for propaganda purposes. But international recognition also gave these performers options and awareness of life outside Soviet borders, which made them security risks. Plisetskaya was denied permission to travel abroad repeatedly during the 1960s despite her fame, with authorities fearing she might defect. She was simultaneously the pride of Soviet culture and a person who could not be fully trusted, celebrated in official propaganda while under constant KGB surveillance. Nureyev faced the same contradiction and resolved it differently. He defected to the West in 1961 while on tour in Paris, choosing exile over continued restriction. His defection was a propaganda disaster for the Soviet Union, which had to balance its desire to showcase its cultural achievements abroad against the risk that its most talented performers would flee at the first opportunity. The KGB's involvement in managing performers went far beyond surveillance. Declassified documents from the 1970s and 1980s reveal that the security services maintained detailed files on major entertainers, tracking their associations, monitoring their private conversations, and recruiting informants from within artistic circles. Performers traveling abroad were approached before departure, reminded of their responsibilities to represent Soviet culture appropriately, and often asked to report on any suspicious contacts with foreigners. Some cooperated willingly, viewing this as patriotic duty. Others felt coerced, understanding that refusal to cooperate could mean the end of foreign travel and possibly their careers. The tenor Vladimir Atlantov later described being summoned to a KGB office before a 1976 tour and being told, not asked, that he would provide information about his fellow performers' activities while abroad. He complied because he saw no alternative, then spent the tour consumed by anxiety about what he should report and what he could safely omit. Every social interaction transformed into a potential test of loyalty. The economics of Soviet show business created another layer of control that Westerners often misunderstood. Soviet performers could become famous, but they could not become wealthy in ways comparable to Western stars. All entertainment venues were state-owned, all recordings were produced by state monopolies, and all fees were set by state guidelines. A top performer might earn 3 to 5 times the average Soviet salary, which was comfortable but hardly luxurious, and certainly not enough to buy independence from the system. Foreign tours offered the only real opportunity for significant earnings, because hard currency payments from Western promoters were converted at favorable rates, or sometimes partially retained. This made foreign touring the most coveted opportunity in Soviet show business, which gave authorities enormous leverage. Performers who wanted access to foreign tours had to demonstrate absolute reliability, which meant political conformity, cooperation with security services, and avoidance of any controversy. The economics ensured that even the most famous performers remained dependent on state approval for the opportunities that made their careers worthwhile. Popular music in the USSR illustrated these dynamics with particular clarity because it sat at the intersection of youth culture, Western influence, and party control. The state wanted popular music that Soviet young people would actually listen to, which required some contemporary sound, but it also wanted music that reinforced approved values and did not become a vector for Western cultural penetration. The result was a massive apparatus of official pop music production that created sounds carefully calibrated to be appealing without being dangerous. Organizations like the Soviet State Committee for Television and Radio Broadcasting employed staff whose job was essentially to manufacture acceptable pop music, identifying safe topics, approved musical styles, and reliable performers, then producing albums and television programs that gave young Soviets something to listen to that was not smuggled Beatles records. Some of this music was competently made but ideologically bland, songs about cosmonauts and collective farm harvests set to up-tempo arrangements. Some found genuine audiences despite official origins. Performers like Alla Pugacheva managed to work within the system while maintaining artistic credibility and massive popularity. Pugasheva's career demonstrated the possibilities and limits of success within Soviet show business. By the late 1970s, she had become the Soviet Union's biggest pop star, filling stadiums, selling millions of records, and achieving a level of fame that made her recognizable to virtually every Soviet citizen. She achieved this by mastering the system's requirements while pushing constantly at its boundaries. She performed songs with approved lyrics but delivered them with emotional intensity and vocal techniques that drew from Western pop. She dressed flamboyantly by Soviet standards, wearing outfits that suggested Western glamour without crossing into explicit imitation. She cultivated a public persona that felt individual and even slightly rebellious while maintaining the relationships with cultural authorities necessary to keep working. She understood that she could be as famous as the system allowed, but no more, and that maintaining her position required constant negotiation, knowing when to push and when to accommodate, reading political signals, and adjusting before being forced to adjust. It was exhausting, precarious, and the only way to sustain major success. The absurdities of the system became most visible when Soviet performers encountered Western entertainment industry practices during foreign tours. The jazz musician Igor Butman described his first tour to the United States in 1987 as revelatory, not because of musical differences but because of structural ones. American musicians negotiated their own fees, hired their own managers, chose their own repertoire without clearance processes, and moved between projects freely based on artistic preferences and market demand. Soviet musicians traveled in delegated groups, performed repertoire approved months in advance, received per diem allowances rather than negotiated fees, and returned home to assignments made by state cultural agencies. Butman realized during that tour that the restrictions he had accepted as normal conditions of professional music were actually specific to his system, that other models existed, and that his talent was being channeled through structures designed for control rather than artistic development. That realization was both liberating and deeply disturbing because it revealed the extent of what had been normalized. The final years of the Soviet Union brought these tensions to a breaking point. Gorbachev's glasnost policies beginning in 1985 relaxed censorship and allowed previously forbidden subjects to be discussed publicly, which created enormous confusion in show business. Performers who had spent careers developing instincts for self-censorship suddenly found those instincts obsolete, but they could not be sure how much freedom actually existed or how long it would last. Some rushed to perform material they had kept in drawers for years. Others remained cautious, suspecting the thaw might reverse and wanting to avoid being caught exposed when it did. The comedy duo Ilchenko and Kartsev began performing sketches in 1987 that directly satirized Soviet bureaucracy in ways that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier, and audiences responded with a kind of ecstatic relief, finally hearing their frustrations articulated publicly. But many older performers found glasnost disorienting rather than liberating, having internalized restrictions so deeply that removing them felt like losing the structure that had defined their professional lives. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, show business underwent transformation as rapid and wrenching as any sector of society. State subsidies disappeared virtually overnight. The massive apparatus of official cultural production, which had employed tens of thousands and supported performers from childhood through retirement, simply ceased to function. Theaters that had operated for decades closed within months when funding vanished. Regional variety shows that had toured smaller cities stopped touring when transportation and booking networks collapsed. The recording monopoly Melodia fragmented into competing private labels. Performers who had been stars in the Soviet system found their fame non-transferable to the new market economy, their skills suited for a context that no longer existed. Some adapted, learning to navigate commercial music industry practices, building new careers in the chaotic Russian entertainment market of the 1990s. Many did not, their training too specific to Soviet conditions, their professional identities too bound to institutional structures that had evaporated, but the Soviet show business system left legacies that outlasted the USSR itself, patterns that continued to shape post-Soviet entertainment culture for decades. The habit of reading performances for subtext, of assuming that what artists said publicly might differ from what they actually meant, persisted long after censorship ended. The expectation that entertainment should serve social purposes beyond mere diversion, that art should carry meaning and comment on collective life, remained embedded in audience expectations. The networks and institutions built during Soviet decades, though transformed, provided foundations for new entertainment industries. The Moscow Art Theater still operates. The Bolshoi Ballet remains world-renowned. The performance schools that train Soviet stars continue training new generations. Their pedagogical methods refined over decades, even as their ideological content has been stripped away. Perhaps most significantly, the experience of Soviet performers illuminates something universal about the relationship between art and power in any system. Show business everywhere exists in tension between creative expression and commercial or political demands, between individual vision and audience expectations, between artistic integrity and practical necessity. The Soviet system made these tensions unusually explicit and unusually severe, but it did not invent them. Understanding how Soviet performers navigated impossible constraints, how they found spaces for genuine artistry within systems designed to prevent it, and what psychological costs they paid for careers lived under constant surveillance reveals mechanisms of control and adaptation that manifest in different forms and degrees, wherever art meets authority, wherever fame intersects with ideology, and wherever the price of staying on stage is measured not just in talent, but in compliance.